Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Seamus McCaffrey. I'm the chair of AgriSearch. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar this evening, jointly organised by AFBI, CAFRE, DAERA and AgriSearch to discuss the growing of protein crops in Northern Ireland and the potential for their use in dairy cow units. We'll look at an overview of the protein pilot scheme, advice in crop husbandry, farmers' experience in growing crops, and the inclusion of field beans research in dairy cow diets. So I think that's the introduction, and that allows us to move to invite our first speaker, Dr. Rosemary Agnew. Rosemary is the Transition Policy Director within the department. Her responsibilities include EU preparations across the department and the development of future agricultural policy framework. Her division is one of 6 within the Food and Farming Group. She works closely with the Northern Ireland Civil Service and Whitehall departments and agri-food stakeholders. So when you're ready, Rosemary, we'd invite you to the first presentation, if you please.
Thank you very much, Seamus, and good evening, everyone. Lee, if I could have my first slide, please. Really just an introduction, folks. I'm very grateful tonight to have this opportunity to outline the protein crops scheme for the 2021 and 2022 scheme years. This was announced by Minister Lyons on the 11th of February, and that followed a short formal consultation that the department undertook at the end of last year. Next slide, please, Lee. Just by way of introduction, and the chairman tonight has already mentioned that part of my responsibilities have been EU exit, but leaving the EU has provided a unique opportunity for DAERA and for other devolved administrations in England, Scotland and Wales to design future agricultural policy and support schemes for the first time in over 40 years. DAERA in 2018 co-designed a future agricultural framework with stakeholders and defined that vision around 4 outcomes that we would seek to achieve. Minister Poots has recently endorsed and agreed with the delivery and that vision around those 4 outcomes. They are an industry that pursues increased productivity, an industry that is environmentally sustainable, move on, Lee, please, an industry that displays improved resilience to external shocks, an industry which operates in an integrated, efficient, sustainable, competitive, responsive supply chain. I've shortened all of those because there's a lot of words on those slides, but I'm sure all of you are able to read through them. Future schemes must help farmers develop their businesses, no matter where they farm, become more efficient and maximise the sustainable returns from assets at their disposal, and that includes the environmental assets. I know Minister Poots is very keen to say a little bit more around future schemes, and he hopes to do that in the next couple of months. Turning then to protein crops. Protein crop production, peas, beans and sweet lupins in Northern Ireland has traditionally been very limited. To give you an idea of that, there were 153 hectares declared on a single application form last year from around 30 farm businesses. The crops are grown primarily to provide a break crop in cereal crop rotations, which have the effect of reducing soil-borne cereal disease burdens and increasing soil nitrogen levels. Importantly as well, Northern Ireland is currently almost totally dependent on imported soya and other proteins in animal feed manufacture. And in 2019, the use of soya alone in feedstuffs manufacture was around 370,000 tonnes, and adding other high protein animal feeds would bring this to well over 500,000 tonnes, perhaps well exceeding it. And looking at introducing a protein crop scheme and the scheme that would support the growing of protein crops, it has been introduced in the context of Northern Ireland's continued dependence on imported plant proteins such as soya, and to encourage best practice in crop rotation, pest management and crop diversity. The funding for the scheme will come from the overall agricultural support budget, and existing claimants to other agricultural support schemes, such as the Basic Payment Scheme, or commonly referred to as Single Farm Payment, will see no reduction in funding they receive as a result of the introduction of the protein crop scheme. You move on, please, Lee. So the policy objectives from the Minister's point of view in introducing this scheme was to create a domestically produced source of protein for animal feed, to provide agronomic benefits within arable rotations, and to provide an alternative source of income on those farms. I'd like to move on now to say something quite quickly around application, payment rates, eligibility under the scheme, the eligible crops, and then the eligibility criteria themselves. So firstly, if we look at the application, the protein crop scheme is a standalone scheme, and applicants do not necessarily have to be claiming BPS or basic payment scheme to be eligible. The scheme launched on the 1st of March. Dual use claims are not permitted. That is, a basic payment scheme and a protein crops payment cannot be claimed by two different claimants on the same field parcel. Initially, the protein crop scheme is a 2-year pilot starting in 2021 and will be reviewed at the end of 2022. Applications will be made through the 2021 single year or scheme year single application and map service. There's a tick box on the actual single application form if you wish to claim the protein crop scheme, and it's important that you tick this box if you wish to make that claim. It is intended that payments under the scheme will be paid alongside the basic payment scheme from October 2021. It may be that two payments are made rather than an integrated payment, but we're still working on that information. Looking at the payment rates and eligibility, the payment rate has been set at £330 per hectare. That's just over £133 per acre. And as I said, in 2020, 153 hectares of protein crops were grown in Northern Ireland. So Minister Lyons agreed that the total area eligible for payment should be capped at 1,000 hectares for both 2021 and 2022. So the maximum budget available in any 1 year is £330,000 sterling, or £330 sterling. If more than 1,000 hectares are determined as eligible, a linear scale back will be applied and payment will be made on that scale backed area. Now we can pick that up in questions if you wish. In terms of the eligible crops, the eligible crops are spring beans, code NF1, spring peas, code NF1, spring field beans, code NF2, winter field beans, code NF3, and spring sweet lupins, NF4. Winter lupins are also eligible, code NF5, but based on information that was provided by CAFRE, it's unlikely that they will grow sufficiently within Northern Ireland, so I haven't included them on this slide. The forage crops, clover, alfalfa or lucerne, alfalfa/lucerne are not eligible for aid under this scheme, only peas, beans and lupins. So moving on finally to the eligibility criteria that exist for the scheme. A claimant must have a Category 1 Farm Business ID number, must not have an approved Nutrient Action Programme derogation. It's a condition of a NAP derogation that you do not grow leguminous or protein crops. If you do so, you will be in breach of one of the conditions of your derogation, and you could face penalties and be ineligible to apply for a NAP derogation in the following year. Based on the DAERA records, there are no businesses last year who would have fallen into this category, but just be aware that if you have a NAP derogation, you should not apply to this scheme. The minimum area claimed must be at least 0.3 hectares with a minimum of 0.1 hectare in each field. Applicants may only claim on land planted in protein crops, specified NF1 to NF5, and all crops must be sown in line with normal husbandry practices. And very shortly, Lee will take you through some of those sort of normal type practices. Areas of protein crops sown in a mixture with cereals or other crops will not be eligible for the scheme, and undersowing with grass or another cereal crop is not permitted. Protein crops must not be harvested until after the 31st of July, and they should be in the ground at the time when the single application is made. That would normally be by the 10th of June. How they are harvested doesn't impact on the payment at all. The payment is still there. they must be in the ground until the 31st of July. Protein crop scheme will be subject to normal DAERA controls, physical and satellite, and applicants will be selected, or a percentage of applicants will be selected for a physical inspection. Thank you very much, Seamus. That's me.
So thank you, Rosemary, very comprehensive, and look forward to questions on your session at the end. The next part of our presentation has two speakers, Lee McLean and Simon Bass. Lee is the CAFRE Crops Development Advisor currently working with growers in the Eastern region. Lee's interest in protein crops comes from work he did as a crops technologist in his early years with CAFRE growing spring beans at Loughry campus. And the second speaker in this session is Simon Bass. Simon is an arable farmer based at Acton House Farm in Points Pass. He grows wheat, barley, oats, oilseed rape and beans in rotation, with all crops supplying local markets. And Acton House Farm is a LEAF accredited farm producing cereals under higher level environmental stewardship. The farm runs a pedigree Angus herd. So on that, I invite Lee and Simon. I think Lee's going first.
The first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to look a wee bit about why you grow protein crops. So what are the benefits? And then some considerations anybody should make before they consider or before they grow any protein crops. Then we will be comparing the combinable protein crops that Rosemary mentioned, peas, beans and sweet lupins, and we will be looking at more detail at spring beans and their agronomy, some key points. And then sort of the last slide will be a practical considerations given to us by Simon and some of his thoughts. Just at this point, I would like to invite or introduce Simon. Simon, could you maybe tell us a wee bit about what your experience is, how long you've been growing protein crops?
Thanks, Lee. Yes, as we've heard, I'm an arable farmer from Points Pass in County Armagh. We've been growing protein crops on this farm for over 20 years now. We've grown most of the crops already mentioned, including peas, lupins, and most recently we've settled on spring beans as sort of one of our core crops within our rotation, mainly as a break crop. However, we've worked hard on developing local markets for beans, and that includes supplying and participating in the AFBI trial, which we'll hear a little more about later on.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. We'll be hearing a wee bit more from you and your experience a little later on. So, first of all, protein crops, what are the benefits? Well, as Simon mentioned, they're a break crop from cereals, and it's really that take-all break that they provide the big benefit in allowing you to follow on with the first cereal. We hear the term integrated pest management, and protein crops can be used as a way of integrated pest management to manage that take-all disease risk, but can also be used to control grass weeds, and not just in that crop, but throughout the rotation. In terms of a crop to grow, they're relatively straightforward to manage, and they're also, and this is the important point, a nitrogen fixing crop. The photograph shows there a little bean seedling, and you can see there the white balls are the sort of nodules that have developed. And what they do is they take nitrogen, fix it from the atmosphere, and provide that for not only their own growth, but the growth of the following crops. In terms of the practicalities, any protein crop can help spread the workload, whether that's a slightly earlier drilling window in the spring than your cereals, or whether it's a later harvest. For some farmers, that can be quite a big benefit. And as Rosemary mentioned, they also have environmental benefits. In terms of a crop, they would have a lower carbon footprint than cereals, and they also provide diversity to our landscape, a flowering crop or flowering crops, which are a source of feed for bees and other pollinators. So some important considerations before you consider growing protein crops on your own farm. The first of all, do they enhance your crop rotation? A lot of arable farmers are always looking for that good break crop rotation, so to give them some of the benefits that I've mentioned in the last slide. For some farms, maybe some of the spring break crop options don't work that well, maybe not the type of land that's suited well to growing potatoes or maize or veg crops, so maybe a good option there. The second consideration is, can you get them harvested? And as I'll touch on, the like of beans can be quite late to harvest, and there are difficulties sometimes in harvesting peas. Bearing that in mind, you've got to consider, will they compromise or complement the following crop? If they're late harvest and they hold up your establishment of the following crop, they can maybe reduce the chance of success. However, as I've mentioned, there's that potential to carry on quite a lot of nitrogen to the following crop, so they can complement it quite well. Do they spread risk in your business? Not just in terms of getting work done, but in some years certain crops will do better than others, so it's good to have a spread of crops in your portfolio. And the last point is, can you find a market for them? And this is one that I think is quite important. So what are the marketing options? Well, for a lot of you that have livestock, obviously you'll be looking to feed them on your own farm. However, for arable farms that maybe don't have any stock, there is that option to sell to neighbouring farms. The third option then is local feed mills. Now, it's worth noting that not all local feed mills will want or will be interested in taking protein crops. However, there are some out there are, and it's worth maybe making a few phone calls and looking around a wee bit to see if that's an option that you have available to you. So let's look at the three crops that I've outlined earlier. The first one's peas, spring sown, and a protein of 24%. As I mentioned, there are some local markets available, and peas' biggest benefit would be that they are the earliest to harvest of all the three protein crops, and yield is typically in the region of 4 to 5 tonnes per hectare. The downside of peas is usually, most of them sort of relate to the harvest. There tends to be quite a narrow harvest window. They do have a tendency to lodge, particularly if we get heavy rain or wind before harvest, and this means losses can be quite big pre-harvest. Ideally, when harvesting peas, they need dry, sunny conditions to have a successful and an easy harvest. If you get that, they can be quite easy to harvest, but if you don't, it can be quite difficult. So really, with peas, harvest can be quite unpredictable, and that's probably their biggest drawback. Lupins also spring sown, and there are a wide range of types, differentiated by their flowering or their growth habit. Yield is much lower at 2 to 3.5 tonnes per hectare. Protein's higher than with peas and beans at 30 to 40%, depending on the type, and they are considered a high quality protein, the most similar to soya of any of the crops that we're looking at. The downside of lupins is currently there are known local markets established. As I mentioned, they are lower yielding, and that can be a big knock on the profitability of growing them as a crop. In terms of harvest, they tend to be after peas, usually into September, and can run on quite late depending on the type, as late as beans or possibly later. Branching types do have a tendency to lodge, and it is worth noting that there are very limited herbicide options, the same for fungicides. As this is quite a minority crop, it doesn't appear on the label of a lot of products. There is off-label approvals that will get you around that, but that's at your own user's risk. Now, the third of the crops is beans, and beans are they're really the only feasible one that can be spring or winter sown here in Northern Ireland. Protein's 29%, and as I mentioned, local markets are available. They suit early sowing and would be able to sow them earlier than any other cereal or any of the other protein crops in the spring. Yield is typically around 5 tonnes per hectare, and they do stand well. There are very few losses pre-harvest, and they can be harvested in less than perfect conditions. As I mentioned, with peas you want it dry and sunny, not so much with beans, and probably gives them more suitable days to harvest. That ability to stand and withstand the weather means that there's quite a wide harvest window with beans. In terms of drawbacks or disadvantages, yes, they are the latest to harvest, and there is a degree of yield variability year on year. So let's just compare those three combinable crops, peas, beans and lupins. In terms of sowing, all three can be sown in the spring, and there are winter varieties available of beans. Not the same for peas and lupins. In terms of local markets, there are small local markets developed for peas and beans, nothing yet for lupins. In terms of weed control options, peas and beans, while there might not be a wide range of products, the products that are there do work very well. It is more limited whenever it comes to weed control on lupins. In terms of harvest, peas, yes, will be ahead of either lupins or beans, which will follow up probably the last. In terms of ease of harvest, beans usually very easy to combine. Peas can be the same as can lupins, but it is very much weather dependent on how well the crop stands. The same applies to field losses. Beans being quite good, peas and lupins a bit more variable. And in terms of potential yield, beans are out in front, peas following in behind, and lupins quite a wee bit behind the two of them. So bearing this in mind, at CAFRE we looked as part of a technology project in more detail at growing beans here in Northern Ireland. And some of the findings that we found over the years that we have been growing them. Broadleaved weed controlled options are limited, so a pre-emergent herbicide is essential to get good weed control. Grass weeds can be successfully controlled, not just difficult to control grass weeds, but also volunteer cereals as well. And it's worth noting, if there are difficult to control grass weeds, it's not just controlling them in this crop, but as part of the rotation, so controlling them in the wider rotation. It is worth noting that sprayer hygiene is essential. No matter what protein crop it is, they can be quite delicate, and poor washout and any sort of residues of herbicide can severely stunt the crop. Might not kill it, but it'll definitely take a big knock on yield. In terms of nutrition, they're a low input crop. If you're sitting at P and K indexes of 3, there's no need to put on any artificial fertilizer. And diseases are manageable. As you can see there, you will get chocolate spot as the picture in the right hand side, but with either 1 or 2 fungicides around flowering time, that's more than manageable. Very few pests here in Northern Ireland, and really it's pulse rotation. You want to keep it to 1 in 5. Any more frequently than that, and there may be seedling disease issues. So, how have the spring beans performed at CAFRE? Well, the blue bars show the yield and the scales over on the right hand side there. So yielding anything from about 6.5 tonnes to the hectare at their highest to just over 3.5 at their lowest. In terms of price, it's somewhere usually between 140 and just over £200 per tonne that we've valued them at. And in terms of gross margin, the best year just over £900 per hectare, and the poorest year just a little over 400. So there is a degree of variability there. It is worth noting this graph is showing the growing costs without drying included, which can be considerable some years. So at this point, I'm going to ask Simon to sort of come back in and give us some of his thoughts. And the first question that I put to you, Simon, is how would you say that protein crops have contributed to your rotation?
I think for me they're an excellent break crop. That's already been mentioned. They fit very well into a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 7 rotation, and I have one bean crop between wheats generally. The following crop always does very well. Certainly my best wheats would follow beans. I suppose on a sort of practical point, they've very easily incorporated and tilled post-harvest. The seed bed's generally very good. The stalks break down very well and allow establishment of the following crop quite well, provided it's harvested on time. So they contribute well to the rotation, I think, in general.
Okay, and in terms of management, I had said, Simon, that they're straightforward to manage. Would you agree with that, or what are the sort of things that you really want to try and get right or need to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think they do require an element of management. They're certainly not maybe as intensive as a wheat or barley crop, but they do, as you've already mentioned, require some specific management. They're certainly not a crop where you can just plant them and close the gate and come back in time for harvest. I think, as you've already said, as a legume, they don't require any nitrogen, which is obviously a good point in terms of not just environment. It's a big positive around environment, but also in terms of sort of management throughout the season. But I feel, I suppose, around crop management, there's three key points. First one for me is drilling. Drilling as early as possible in the spring. As I say, predominantly spring beans that I would have grown of late. Generally, the earlier drilled, the earlier they're harvested ultimately. So I would be aiming really from mid-March to preferably before the end of March, the first week of April latest, in order to get the harvest done sort of by end of September latest. The second point, I suppose, around management, or the second key point, would be herbicide. They need two. They're not competitive generally, so it's very important to control broadleaf weeds early, and a pre-emergent is essential in my experience. I suppose the third point then is around desiccation, and that leads into harvest. Desiccate earlier than the crop may look. They can be pretty green at times, but certainly by sort of late August, I would generally try and desiccate and allow them then to ripen over time. They won't behave like a cereal crop and come in over sort of a week to 10 days. They generally take longer, even 3, potentially 4 weeks before they're ready to harvest. So early desiccation, I find, is certainly a key management point. You've mentioned fungicides. Generally 1 to 2. I've never got away with no fungicides. I know some people have mentioned not applying fungicides before, but they are susceptible to particularly chocolate spot and rust. And I suppose on the fungicides are a bit of a challenge with the loss of chlorothalonil. That would have been sort of the go-to, but there are fungicides available, so 1 or 2 I would suspect there.
Okay. And I suppose really similar to our experience, early drilling is key to getting that early harvest, Simon. That's probably the biggest thing to getting you an early harvest. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think because they are a break crop, you obviously want to get a good crop in behind them. And if you're harvesting them late, I mean, I have seen us harvesting them into sort of mid-October and even later some years. That has generally been because we haven't got them in early enough, because of weather or something. And I think they generally follow the earlier in, and they will go in they don't have to be ideal conditions. They will drill in behind a plough quite well. So as soon as the ground's ready for tilling, they can be established quite easily.
Okay. I suppose one thing that I'd mention is that need to consider a market. How easy have you found finding a market for them, or do you use them yourself, or sort of what has your marketing strategy been, Simon?
Yeah, I think that it's a really important point. I mean, I suppose we do use some ourselves, but certainly not all that we would be growing. And I suppose many will be listening to this will be growing for their own use. However, when it comes to your own use, you still have to consider how are you going to store them? Are you going to dry them? Are you going to use other treatments to store them throughout the season? So, I think understanding that is quite important before you start, because drying can be costly, as can treatments. And I mean, over the years, we have worked hard to establish a market, a local market into a miller or a feed producer. So I think what I'd hope to see, with a greater area grown, hopefully in the future, and more focus on this crop, that making it'll make this crop more available and marketable locally, which I think will be a benefit to all. But certainly understanding the market that you're aiming for before you plant and establish is certainly important.
Okay. How well would you say that they fit your farming system in terms of fitting in, harvest around other crops or other things going on the farm?
Yeah, they do fit pretty well. As I say, that the lower input, I guess, around fertilizer and the timing of flowering and things, it's sort of later on than cereals. So it does allow you to get your cereal applications done and then hit the beans really at the end. So it definitely fits in terms of management and in terms of, I suppose, treatments. Later harvest as well. Generally it's the last to be harvested, and it can be sometimes a week after the last wheat's harvested, but hopefully generally not too much longer than that. So it fits pretty well. It doesn't come in the middle of anything particularly. So and as I say, a good break crop and easily tilled. So the first crop to be established in the spring. Again, getting our beans in as early as possible, and then moving on to other spring crops. So certainly from a practical management point of view, they fit very well.
Okay, and I know it's one thing that we found that they performed well some years financially. How do you find that they compare with other crops, and I suppose particularly other break crops? Maybe how well do they perform?
Yeah, I think essentially they are a break crop, so they're not particularly comparable to sort of frontline cereal crops. In an arable scenario, as a break crop, they're certainly behind oilseed rape and I suppose oats would be my other break crop. So they certainly wouldn't be financially on the same, I suppose, line as those traditionally, but. It's I suppose the advantage of a following crop, the lower input, but I think when it comes to the financial element, I mean your slide showing it, they can be inconsistent. My experience has been, you can have a sort of a very low yield, maybe 1 in 4 or 5 years, and sometimes it's unexplainable. This year it was pretty evident that they suffered badly with a very dry spring post planting. So they can be volatile. As you've said, and I think having a scheme to hopefully take that volatility out will be an important element.
And so I suppose really that's the point that we're maybe finishing up on there, Simon. Is do you think that the protein the crops payment will help reduce the risk?
I think that's exactly what it'll do. From my point of view, I think they've been volatile over the years, both in terms of yield and price, and the scheme will hopefully underpin that. But I think a bit more than that. I would hope it'll be, something that will help the market develop. I think it's really important that it does that and isn't simply absorbed by the market. I think it can help to develop existing and new markets. And I feel there's a great opportunity with this crop with the correct investment and the correct development around market. I think of a potential homegrown protein source, supporting existing crop rotations, and a very good way to support the environmental credentials, particularly of the Northern Ireland agri sector.
Okay, so potentially a good news story coming down the line there. Okay, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you everybody for listening. At this point, I'll hand back to Seamus.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Simon. Very practical presentation and some very good signposting there. And that brings us to the final speaker for tonight, who's Dr. Conrad Ferris. Conrad is responsible for a Sustainable Dairy Systems Research Programme at AFBI. He has over 25 years' experience in dairy research across a wide range of areas. These include the development of feeding and management strategies for high genetic merit dairy cows within grassland-based systems, winter feeding strategies, dairy systems research, optimum dairy cow genotypes, and reducing the environmental impact of milk production systems. So on that note, over to you, Conrad.
Okay, Seamus, thank you very much for that introduction. And could I just begin by acknowledging my co-author here on the first slide, David Johnson. Most of the work that I'm presenting this evening was done by David as part of his PhD at Hillsborough and through Queen's. So I acknowledge David's role in that. Okay, Lee. Okay, so just by way of introduction, we've heard from the last two speakers that certainly field beans can be grown within Northern Ireland. But the question that I would like to address is, can they replace imported protein feeds? And this whole area, as I've said, was examined in a series of experiments at AFBI between 2015 and 2017. David Johnson's PhD, as I referred to. The research was funded by DAERA and by AgriSearch, and all the studies use locally sourced beans, as Simon has already indicated. Lee, please. Okay, so just a brief summary of the nutritional composition of beans, the bottom line, the table, compared to soya and rapeseed meal. So if we look at the first column, crude protein, so field beans have a lower protein than both soya and rapeseed meal. But what they do have, very different from a lot of the protein feeds, is a high starch content of about 40% starch on a dry matter, whereas there's very little starch in soya and rapeseed meal. They also have a slightly higher AME content than soya and rapeseed meal, and these are just book values that I'm presenting here. There are a couple of negatives from a nutritional point of view, and that is that field beans do contain a number of anti-nutritional factors, for example, tannins, and they also contain a number of phytoestrogens. And because of that, traditionally a maximum inclusion level of 1 to 2 kilograms per day have been suggested for dairy cows, although that's probably quite a historical figure that was recommended in the past. The other point just to highlight is they are quite high in phosphorus, as are most protein crops, but they actually have a relatively poor or a poorer phosphorus to protein ratio than soya and rapeseed. So that means they have high phosphorus but slightly lower protein. So those are a number of nutrition limitations, but it was within that context that we wanted to examine the role in dairy cow diets. So at Hillsborough, we carried out 3 studies over a couple of years. Experiment 1 looked at the effect of low protein levels of field beans in the diet of cows. Experiment 2 examined the effect of high levels of field beans in early lactation, and experiment 3 looked at the effect of processing techniques. So those are the 3 studies we carried out. So we'll just move on to examine experiment 1, which looked at low levels of field beans in dairy cow diets. There were 60 mid-lactation cows in this study for a 14-week period. All cows were offered 10 kilograms of concentrates through an out-of-parlour feeder, and that concentrate contained the field beans, which were included to achieve intakes of beans of either 0, 1.6, 3.2 or 4.7 kilograms per cow per day. So even in this first study, we were going quite a bit higher than what's normally recommended. So this slide, I'm not going to dwell very much on it. Just across the top, it shows the 4 levels of beans, 0, 1.6, 3.2 and 4.7. And down along the side, we've got the performance parameters. And firstly, just see total dry matter intake there in the first line, no effect. So the anti-nutritional compounds that we were concerned about certainly didn't have any impact on intake here. And without going into the details, milk yield, milk composition, none of these were influenced by the inclusion of beans up to 4.7 kilograms. So this first study was extremely promising. So we then decided to push it on out in our second study. Lee, please. And as this study looked at, sorry, if you could just pop back. Yeah, this study looked at high levels of beans in the diet of early lactation cows. So we had 69 early lactation cows in the study. The study started basically at calving and ran for a 20-week period. All cows were offered a total mixed ration containing 45% concentrates, and that concentrate was designed to achieve 3 levels of beans. That was either 0 beans, low beans, which I'm calling 4.2 kilos here, or a high beans treatment. Cows were consuming 8.4 kilos of beans per cow per day. So that last treatment is really much higher than we would ever be advocating in practice, but we decided to push it out from a research point of view. How do we actually balance these rations? Well, firstly, I acknowledge the help that I had from Jim Pritchard of Troy Nutrition here in developing these. So you can see across the top, these are the ingredients down the side and the 3 bean treatments. And field beans, we range from 0, as I've said, right through to almost 700 kilograms of beans per ton of concentrate. So really a concentrate that was more than 3/4 made up of, 2/3 made up of beans. How did we get the beans in? Well, we reduced the maize right down to by over half, and we totally removed the wheat from the diet. That's in the blue box there. And then if we move down to the green box, you can see with the high beans treatment, we totally removed the soya bean, we totally removed the rapeseed meal, and totally removed the maize gluten. So if we just look at the extreme right-hand column, the high beans treatment, really a very extreme concentrate here, 70% beans in the concentrate, a little bit of maize, and a little bit of soya hulls and minerals, etc. So how did the cows perform on these three levels? So Leah, if we could just move on, thanks. So this slide highlights the impact of high levels of beans in early lactation. And if we just look at the first line to start off with, total intake, again, total dry matter intake here was unaffected. So even at 8.4 kilograms of beans in the dairy cow diets, again, anti-nutritional factors, which we know are there, certainly weren't having an impact on the performance of the cows. Milk yield wasn't affected. There was no significant difference here. But where we did start to see a negative impact at this high level of beans was we found a bit of a reduction in milk fat content, and I suspect that was probably due to that high beans treatment having a higher starch content than the other two treatments. It was actually impossible for us to totally balance the amount of starch in all three diets, and also a fall in milk protein. And again, I suspect that could be probably due to most likely a deficiency in methionine, and that for beans are known to be low in methionine. So certainly some negative impacts coming in there at the highest level of beans inclusion. If we could just move on then, Lee, please, to the next slide, which looks at the impact of beans on fertility. And this is the same study. And you can see the first line shows a percent of cows showing estrus within 42 days of calving, and there was no impact there of beans in terms of estrus. If you look then at percent of cows pregnant, the first plus second service, at the highest level of beans here, 8.4 kilograms per cow per day, the conception rate was lower. Is it a genuine effect? I can't answer that. We had about 30 cows per treatment, and we know that in reality we need about 200 cows on a treatment to really establish clear fertility effects. But there was that slightly lower figure, and we know that there are these phytoestrogens in beans, as they are in soybean and other legume crops as well. So beans isn't any way unique in that. We were just operating with very high inclusion levels. But certainly at the 4.2 kilogram, there was absolutely no evidence of any impact on pregnancy rate there. None of the differences, I should say, in the table were actually significant. So sorry, if we just move on then to the third experiment, which was looking at post-harvest treatment of beans. And Simon alluded a little bit to some of the issues here. Field beans grown in Northern Ireland normally need to be dried post-harvest. I think occasionally they can be harvested around 14%, but normally they are harvested with much more moisture in that. And drying is one obvious route by which to preserve the beans. This study really looked to see if acid treatment of moist beans on farm would offer an alternative preservation method. And also within this study, we wanted just to examine if degree of milling, how finely the beans were milled, had an impact. So if we could just move on to the results of this one, Lee, please. Just as again a little bit more in the details. So we had 3 post-harvest treatments, as I've said. The first one was dried beans, which were coarsely rolled, and then we had dried beans which were finely rolled, really looked almost milled here, and then we had the moist propionic treated beans, which were then rolled, and you can see the beans, there's still pretty much the structure there. We had about 40% beans in the concentrate in this study, although that was only 3.5 kilograms per day because we did struggle to get the beans we needed. I'll not dwell on the slide. I'm not going into the detail here, apart from to say that the 3 post-harvest treatments we looked at, none of the differences here were significant in terms of their impact on performance. So it certainly looks as if moist propionic acid treatment of beans does provide a on-farm approach by which to preserve them. Just going to move on to finish off by a little bit on the economics. The economics, and this slide highlights just the price of beans relative to other protein ingredients between 2013 and 2019. And this data is taken from the DAERA website. So you can see here the top brown line is actually the cost of soybean meal, which, as you'd expect, is more expensive than either rape meal, maize gluten, or field beans. Field beans being the red line. And if you look there, you can see back 2013-14, it tended to be a little bit more expensive than rape and maize gluten, while 16, 17, 18 beans were less expensive than the other protein ingredients. 2019, then the price of beans rose quite considerably, while the price of soya came down. So that just gives you an idea of there is a lot of variation in the price. And then if we just look at the next slide, this slide actually is based on the first experiment that I presented here this evening. And what I have done is taken the price of all the individual feed ingredients off the DAERA website from 2013 through to 2019 and applied those to the two different rations we fed with the 0 beans treatment and the 4.8 kilograms beans treatment. And you can see there's a 3-year period, 2013 to 2015, while including beans in the ration didn't actually impact the cost of the ration. Then we had a number of years, 2016, 17 and 18, where we had put beans in the ration, replacing part of the soya and rapeseed. In those 3 years, the cost of the concentrate would have been about £20 per tonne cheaper than it was. And then you can see 2019, putting beans in the ration actually increased the cost of the ration. So again, a lot of variation depending very much on the relative cost of beans versus other ingredients. Just finishing off here on the actual margin over feed costs of including beans in the ration. And I've looked at this for 5 years, 2015 through to 2019. And again, this was based on the first experiment I looked at this evening for the 0 beans treatment and the 4.7 kilograms beans inclusion treatment. And you can see that in terms of margin over feed cost per cow per day, 2015, there was no effect, whether we had beans in the ration or not. But then 2016, 17 and 18, our margin over feed cost would have been increased by almost 0.2 pence, or 20 pence per cow per day with beans inclusion, while in 2019 the margin would have actually been reduced if we had included beans in the ration. And I think just my final slide here, a couple of brief conclusions. Certainly field beans can be grown and can be included in dairy cow diets in Northern Ireland at between 4 to 5 kilograms per cow per day with no loss in performance. Our results clearly demonstrate that. Higher inclusion levels may be possible with improved diet formulation, specifically looking at some of the limiting amino acids such as methionine. And in terms of the economics will depend on the price of beans relative to other protein ingredients. And as we've seen, that can be quite variable from year to year. So thank you very much for listening. And that's the end of my presentation. And I think at this stage, I'm handing over to Jason for the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Conrad, for that. So we're heading now into the question and answer session. So just a reminder that if you want to put in any questions, just hit on the Q&A button and type in. So my first question is for Rosemary. And the question is, can the protein crop be whole cropped or must it be combined?
Thank you, Jason. Quite simply, the crop must not be harvested until after the 31st of July. What anyone does with it after the 31st of July is entirely up to them. So it can be whole cropped, it can be ensiled, it can be combined, whatever the farmer wishes to do with it. But I would just flag, and perhaps some of my colleagues might wish to comment, protein crops by their very nature are high in protein. They don't ensile terribly well. They will come out very black and very wet. not terribly well fermented, not sure how palatable they were, and I'm not sure at this stage, Jason, whether you would like to ask Conrad or Lee to comment on the ensilability of those crops.
Yeah,
So
that's a fair point. Lee, do you want to comment first of all? On the ensilability, or the desirability of ensiling rather than combining?
Well, I suppose just as Rosemary said, it's quite a high nitrogen crop, or they're quite high nitrogen. Probably practically they'll ensile better if they're drier, and just as they're quite late to harvest, actually getting the dry matter low enough to do that can be quite difficult. I would say that from a practical point of view is probably the big issue.
Thank you. Conrad, do you want to make any points from a kind of feeding point of view of whole crop?
Well, yeah, it's not an area we've looked at, Jason. I know there's been a little bit of work. I think some of the Scandinavian countries, I've seen papers looking at growing beans with cereals and ensiling as a whole crop, but then that's outside, I understand, the remit of the scheme. So I suspect it would be a difficult crop to ensile by themselves.
Okay, thank you. A question for Lee here. I think it was said that peas attract nitrogen pickles forming on the roots. Is this just nitrogen that is absorbed from the atmosphere?
Yeah, the picture that I showed was in beans, but the same thing would be for peas or for lupins. Whenever the crop gets grown, it'll produce nitrogen forming nodules on the roots, and that's those wee white pickles. And basically it's those that are pulling the nitrogen in from the atmosphere. So you'll see that, you should see that on any of the crops, those nodules forming.
Thank you. Rosemary, a question for you. There's a comment here about obviously the harvesting difficulties of these crops. Should lucerne not have been included, as it will last 3 years, and why? What are the reasons that it was left out?
At its outset, Minister Poots asked us to consult on a protein crop scheme for combinable crops. Lucerne, to the best of my knowledge, would not fit into the definition of a combinable crop. It is a forage crop. When we consulted prior to Christmas, we asked a question around the eligible crops under the scheme. And broadly, the majority of applicants were content with the crops that would be eligible under the pilot schemes. At that stage, we were only talking about a 1-year scheme. The pilot has now been extended to 2 years. And as I said, the schemes will be reviewed at the end of that 2022 period. So lucerne isn't currently included because it's not a combinable protein crop, but don't know where we're going in the future. So I'm not sure that exactly answers the question. The other thing, the scheme was designed very, very quickly. So it was kept as tight and as simple as possible, which was why it was held to peas, beans and lupins. So thank you, Jason.
Okay, thank you. And another thing here, Rosemary, for yourself, if the crop fails, will payments still be made? Will DAERA ask for proof that the crops were grown?
There is a series, thanks Jason, there's a series of Q&A on the DAERA website, so I would really ask everyone if they have time to go and look at that series of Q&A, but you're certainly advised to keep information around your seeds purchase, your supply of seeds, your sowing, etc. And if the crop fails, the recommendations or the answers in those Q&A that are that you should submit a force majeure form within 15 days, working days of being in a position to do so, indicating the extent and the cause of the failure. And then it will be considered on a case-by-case basis. So the straightforward answer is it's a case-by-case basis. We've asked people to keep all the necessary records, and if their crop fails, to submit a form FML1 within 15 working days, and it will be taken from there. So I would have to say depends on the extent of the crop failure, probably.
Okay, thank you. Lee, I think this is probably for you or maybe Simon. Thoughts on growing vining beans and maize to lift protein levels on maize crops? This is obviously, they say, based on what's been done in the Midlands.
Yeah, I've noticed that recently. Sort of reading about that. I think yes, it's, I suppose, to provide a more balanced feed, and it would obviously do that. It lift the protein in the maize, but in terms of this scheme, sort of companion cropping or sort of dual cropping, any crops have to be a single stand, so it has to be a single stand of peas, beans, or lupins. Unfortunately, you know, mixed crops like that just won't be eligible. But it might be something sort of further down the line, something worth looking at, Jason. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I'll see a comment here about from a cereal farmer who has inside peas for 6 years, and he admits they are difficult and they do need inoculant. So, do you want to make any comment on using inoculants to ensile whole crop?
It's not something I have any experience. I don't know whether Conrad or anyone else wants to maybe take that one, or anything to add there?
Conrad?
Again, Jason, no, I don't have experience, but I think it's like any inoculant. Make sure the evidence is there that the inoculant has been tested under the conditions that you're using it for, and that there's good research evidence to actually suggest that the inoculant results in animal performance benefits. So that would be the main advice when it comes to any inoculant.
Okay. Question here. I probably think for yourself, Lee, do you or can you use home-saved seed beans even though it's been sprayed off to help harvest?
As Simon said earlier, that just spraying them off won't necessarily bring the crop in any earlier. So for somebody that's thinking of keeping home-saved seed, that shouldn't be an issue for the seed for the following year. But as I would advise anybody, regardless of what crop it is, you're always advised to get a germination test, because it can be variable year to year depending on what the conditions are in the run up to harvest. So if you're considering doing that, I would say that's the most important thing, is get a germination test done.
Sorry, Jason, could I just come in on the back of what Lee said, really in relation to the question I was asked earlier about crop failure? If you use home-saved seed to establish a crop, it could be difficult to provide evidence of crop establishment if there was to be a crop failure, and it's just important to reflect that. Thanks, Jason.
Okay, thank you. Rosemary, there's actually another question here. I think it's probably fairly simply answered, but who do farmers contact regarding applying for the protein growing scheme? So I think from what you said earlier, it's really just a part of this year's basic payment scheme form.
Yes, Jason, it is an application on the single application form. There is a box which you need to tick if you wish to apply for it, and then you just fill in your field data. All you have to do is to tick a box that you're applying for an NF1, NF2, NF3 to 5 crop. If you have any queries, if you phone the single application advisory team, the email is 0300 200 7848. And there's also an email address, and I suspect following this we could get those details put up along with this video, or emailed out to participants. But certainly just a matter of ticking a box on your single application form. Thanks, Jason.
Okay, Rosemary, probably have a policy question here, but given the very low area of arable crops in Northern Ireland and the beans are only going to contribute to be a break crop, can this crop ever contribute to reducing the importation of alternative protein raw materials for the feed industry?
I thought someone might ask me that question. In reality, probably not. But protein crops are there. There was interest in them. Minister Pitts was very interested in them, as was Minister Lyons. Wanted us at least to try to provide support for them. And it's really come from there. I don't think they'll ever completely replace it, if you're putting me on the spot, all of the imported protein. But at least, as Conrad's results have shown, there is potential there. And if the potential is there even on some farms, it could be an additional benefit to those farms. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Rosemary. There's a question here, and it is the crop viable for farmers in a derogation who cannot avail of the scheme? And I'm guessing, Rosemary, the answer is even though they can't avail of the scheme, they still shouldn't grow it because it's basically against the term of their derogation to grow the crop.
Yes, Jason, absolutely correct. If they're in a NAP derogation, it is a condition of that derogation that they do not grow leguminous or protein crops. Therefore, if they grow the crop, they're in breach of their derogation will be removed, and it might be very difficult for them to achieve that or to obtain that derogation in the future. what the department will do over the next couple of weeks is write out to all those farmers who have a derogation, telling them that they should not apply to the protein crop scheme. So hopefully that answers that question, Jason.
Thank you. A question here, I think, for Simon. What do you do, Simon, with the excess coming out of the back of the combine? Is it any use?
Yeah, a good question. I have never actually baled it if I was chopped it behind the combine, but I do know of some neighbours this year who baled it and have done very well out of the bales. So it can be baled. It tends to break up quite a lot coming through the combine. So I think 3 to 5 bales to the acre was sort of the going rate, but they seem to have got on quite well with them this year. So
Okay. That's great. Thanks, Simon.
Chopper.
Rosemary, a question here. Will permanent grassland fields be eligible or arable only? So I suppose if someone's looking to put what was permanent grassland into a protein crop, is there any reason they cannot do that?
There is no reason under the scheme that they cannot do that. But if you could maybe ask Lee to comment, my understanding is that spring beans or spring peas will grow better following in an arable rotation. But under the actual scheme itself, there's no reason they can't do that.
Lee,
Thanks,
do you want to
Jason.
comment on that?
Yeah, I suppose maybe just to make the point, and it's probably anecdotal more than anything else, but the first 3 years we grew spring beans at Lochary, that was on worn ground, which had been in an arable rotation for a long time, and those were the 3 best yielding years. Following that, they were grown at Greenmount, and they were either just after grass or sort of 1-2 years after grass. Now, part of that might be the soil type was slightly heavier, part of it might have been the season, but you know, we wonder if possibly coming out of that sort of high nitrogen grass, they maybe just didn't yield as well, and you know, not sort of foraging as well. Put up a lot of vegetation, but just the yield of beans wasn't as high. But again, as I say, nothing really more than a bit of anecdotal evidence on that one.
Thanks, Lee. A question here about, Rosemary, you said the date. Is there a date it must be harvested by? I know you said that it has to be in the ground on the 31st of July, but is there any deadline for harvesting?
Jason, no. Must be in the ground. Should be in the ground when the application for payment or the application to the scheme is made, which is around the 15th of May. But if you look at the extension, that takes you to the 10th of June. And should not be harvested until after the 31st of July. But after that, it's entirely up to the farmer what he wishes to do. I know Lee and Simon would have recommendations around when the crops would be combined, but they can be harvested any date after the 31st of July. And after is important in that sentence. Okay.
I'm not sure whether it should be for Lee or Conrad, but any feed value in bean straw?
Not something I know a lot about, Jason. I would suspect pretty limited. To be honest about it, I've seen the straw. It's pretty coarse. I would suspect a lot of fibre in it. So I wouldn't think there would be a huge amount of nutritional value, probably higher in protein than cereal straw, but I'm not aware of it. I don't think it's certainly going to go into a dairy cow diet and contribute very much.
Okay, thank you. Question for Simon. What do you see as the biggest challenge to growing a successful crop of field beans?
Yeah, assuming they're planted in good conditions and in good time, the biggest challenge is weed control. Certainly a pre-emergent as early as possible post planting, and then follow that up. So pendimethalin is a pre-emergent, and then bendazone or something like that as your sort of follow-up, but they're not very competitive, so they do need weed control timely weed control.
Okay, no problem. A question, I think probably better for Rosemary. Is CAFRE or DAERA actively approaching feed compounders, seeking their cooperation and incorporating the local proteins into rations?
Well, from a sort of a DAERA headquarters point of view, not at this stage. At this stage, we don't know what the likely uptake is going to be. If you recall, I indicated that last year there were 153 hectares of these crops grown. and we haven't actively taken those steps. Maybe ask Lee to comment from a CAFRE point of view, but we haven't actively moved there yet. We've certainly been in discussion and had some discussions with NICTA around the support for protein crops, but that's as far as it goes.
Lee, do you want to comment?
I suppose it's not really an area of work that I'm closely involved in, and sort of the feed side of it. That's probably more my livestock colleagues, but it would be one thing that I would highlight is really important. Anybody considering growing a protein crop is do your homework, get in contact. You know, whether it's, if you're not going to use them yourself, have you got a neighbouring farmer that will buy them off you, or are there sort of mill options out there? But I'd sort of pick up on something that Simon said earlier on. He said that, you know, he thought that with more beans being grown, that will bring more local millers and sort of feed compounders into that. I think that probably will be the case as they're more available. They probably see them as less of a risk in terms of being able to source supply. So again, that's probably another bit of work to do, or to sort of work on that. But it is important to sort of seek out your market before you put them in the ground.
Okay. Lee, another question for yourself. There is an assumption that beans will grow only in good arable land, but how would they handle slightly less favourable soil or area?
I suppose it depends what somebody's talking about, less favourable. If it's a field that you would cultivate normally, so if you would consider growing a wheat crop or a barley crop in there, there's absolutely no reason that the beans or the other protein crops will grow. But I think the thing to bear in mind is, you know, as I've mentioned, beans are quite late to harvest. So if your ground tends to get wet quite late on and maybe doesn't travel that well, bear that in mind. You know, can you get a combine in there in late September and October? And can you follow that up and get your following crop in? I think the growing's not the issue. It's probably just getting that harvest on that more marginal land. That's what you really need to consider.
That's grand. Well, I think that's all our questions answered. My thanks to the panel, and I will hand back to Seamus to wrap up.
And that then brings me to say thank you to Rosemary, Lee, Simon, Conrad, and to Jason, and to you, the audience, for taking part. So on that note, thank you to everyone.